One of the first games I ever fell in love with was Final Fantasy X for the PlayStation 2. Ever since I played it, I've been enamored with the Final Fantasy series, and I've played all of the mainline entries. From the timeless classics, to the acquired tastes, to the ones I couldn't bring myself to finish. And now that I've played Final Fantasy XVI, the latest entry in the series, what do I think of it? Well, I really like it. I won't say it's perfect because nothing is, but in my opinion, it's the best single-player mainline entry that we've had in literal decades. So let's not beat around the bush and get into it. First things first, I want to address this undercurrent that this isn't a real Final Fantasy game. For those unaware, this game took a very different approach to the other games. It's an action RPG with heavy emphasis on the action that heavily dials back the RPG elements. There's this school of thought that it isn't a real RPG, and it betrays the series' roots to such an extent that it doesn't even count as a Final Fantasy game. Now, if you think this, well, I'm not saying you're stupid, but there's no good way for me to finish that sentence. Like, come on. The series has been moving away from turn-based combat since Final Fantasy IV. The entire point of this series is that the entries are completely disconnected from one another. They each have their own stories and characters and identities completely unrelated to one another. They're free to try new things and experiments, and from a story perspective at least, this is very Final Fantasy. So what about that story, anyhow? Well, all the promotional material would lead you to believe that it's all about Clive Rosfield's quest to get revenge on the people responsible for the death of his brother Joshua, but there's a lot more to it than that. The whole revenge plot is actually just a small part of it. Final Fantasy XVI takes place in the world of Valisthea. It's got all the trappings of medieval fantasy: castles, knights, court intrigue, political kidnappings, incest marriages, all that good crap. There are these towering mother crystals which give people the ability to use magic, but there's also people born with the power to use magic without the use of a crystal, known as bearers. Problem is, they're seen as tools by the society they live in, enslaved and treated as dirt. Our hero Clive managed to escape this fate by virtue of being in the royal family, but when the Duchy of Rosaria falls to the Empire of Sanbreque one night, he's forced into a life of servitude as a soldier for the Empire. This game really wants you to know that slavery is bad, but I'd argue that it's about a bit more than that. You see, I've heard this other really stupid critique that Clive has to learn that slavery is bad, but that just reeks of media illiteracy to me. Dude ends up as a slave within the first 2 hours. He knows slavery is bad. Heck, the first time we see him in media res, he already is a slave. The story's not about realizing that society's corrupt. It's about shaking off the apathy that realization brings and doing something about it. A lot of these takes I've been hearing just sound like people looking for excuses to hate the game. Anyway, in addition to bearers, there are also people known as dominants who have the ability to channel all-powerful beings called icons. These are your traditional Final Fantasy summons, your Shiva, Bahamut, Odin, what have you. The game portrays icons as weapons of mass destruction, like fantasy nukes almost, with stuff like mutually assured destruction being brought up multiple times. This is my personal favorite way that the series has handled summons. Final Fantasy IX did something pretty similar, actually. Anyway, Clive's younger brother Joshua is the dominant of the Phoenix, but the night the Empire attacks, a second icon of fire shows up and just completely rips Joshua a new one. Like, the scene is gruesome on its own, but when you remember that this is technically an 8-year-old kid being ripped to shreds, it's genuinely kinda hard to watch. Clive eventually escapes his enslavement and crosses paths with this game's version of Sid, who sounds like he smoked 12 packs a day since the day he was born. Honestly, he probably has. Sid is the dominant of Rama and runs the Hideaway, a sort of underground railroad for bearers. And from there, a ton of stuff happens that I don't really want to spoil. Now, to put it in perspective just how dense this plot is, let's compare it to Final Fantasy XV for a second. In both of those games, there's a pivotal scene where the protagonists venture behind enemy lines in search of a big important crystal. The ultimate villain pulling all the strings reveals himself, and we jump forward a few years to a point where the world is in shambles. In 15, this happens in the second to last chapter. In 16, it happens about a third of the way through. This thing has a way of screwing with your sense of progression, and I mean that in the best possible way. I genuinely had no idea where the story was going a lot of the time, but it never felt too overwhelming or confusing. The story kind of reminds me of that of Final Fantasy VII, in that there's a lot of things that don't make a whole lot of sense and don't really add up, but towards the end they all start to fit into place. I've heard a lot of complaints that the story is confusing, but come on, by Final Fantasy standards, this plot is pretty darn straightforward. I will say that the ending is also a lot like Final Fantasy VII in that it leaves a lot to interpretation, but as long as you're paying attention, you should never get lost during the course of this game. But a story is only as good as its characters, and we've got an all-star cast if I do say so. Clive is a great protagonist. All the marketing made him out to be a super edgy and angry anti-hero, but the dude's actually a total softie, and I honestly found myself really liking him. Reminds me a lot of Cloud, actually. Throughout the game, he's joined by his faithful canine companion, Torgal. I don't have a whole lot to say about Torgal, just he's a good boy. A very good boy. A great boy, even. Jill might be my personal favorite character. She's Clive's childhood friend who comes along for the journey, and she's super empathetic and constantly emotionally supportive of him throughout the story. She gets involved in the action for a lot of the game, and even gets to have her own revenge story. You know, as a treat. I can't stress enough how much I completely fell in love with her over the course of the game. Her relationship with Clive is so gosh darn sweet, and it was one of the highlights of the game for me. It is kind of a shame that she kind of drops out of the story towards the end, but she's head and shoulders above the last game's female lead. Seriously, I know this video is not about 15, but come on, when the protagonist and his fiancée only share 2 scenes together, you've done something wrong. And the rest of the supporting cast is pretty great too, from the world-weary shopkeeper and blacksmith of the Hideaway, to the lovable potty-mouthed scout with a heart of gold, Gav, to Clive's jovial uncle Byron, to Sid's daughter Mid, who's the human equivalent of Pop Rocks. Even the incidental quest NPCs you come across are pretty interesting and likable. Now, if only I could say the same about the villains. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think they're all bad. A few of the game's antagonists really do stand out. Annabella, for example. The game does a fantastic job making her the most despicable, abhorrent piece of filth ever to walk the earth, and it pays off in spectacular fashion. Seriously, it takes talent to create a character this detestable, so hats off to the writing team. And then there's the main villain. I'm not going to get too into spoilers, but I will say this. As a character, he's not nearly as interesting as the likes of Arden or Emmett Selk, but as a nemesis for Clive specifically, and as an embodiment of the game's themes, he's absolutely fantastic. Doesn't hurt that he has a really cool and creepy design and has an epic final boss fight. But the rest of the villains don't really impress me all that much. They're either really one note or don't have enough screen time to really leave that much of an impact. They're still serviceable, mind you, they're decent characters, they just don't quite live up to their full potential. All in all, the story shines in my opinion. You have your Game of Thrones politics in the background for sure, but the focus is always on its effects on our protagonists and how they react to it. The game does expect you to be paying attention at all times, but the characters do a great job holding your attention. And then there's a lot of fun references to earlier Final Fantasy games. These Black Mage scarecrows were a really cute detail, and as an FF14 player, the Chimera fight having the exact same attacks made me chuckle a little. Before we move on to the gameplay, I'd like to bring up the soundtrack because it is phenomenal. I mean it, Masayoshi Soken just knocked it out of the park with this one. He's actually the first person since Nobuo Uematsu to score more than one mainline entry in the series, and hopefully I hope to see more from him. Now let's move on to the gameplay, specifically the combat. The battle system was designed by Devil May Cry alumni, and it shows. Clive gains the powers of the various icons he encounters, and he can use their powers at will as he fights enemies. Combat just feels really good. Your attacks feel like they have actual weight, dodging and parrying both feel incredibly satisfying to pull off, the icon abilities are unique and fun to use, and the boss encounters are really well designed. It also brings back the stagger mechanic first introduced in Final Fantasy XIII, and while I'm not terribly fond of that game, it did introduce this mechanic into the franchise, so I guess I should be thankful. The icon system also brings in a ton of strategic thinking. Like, it reminded me a lot of the older Final Fantasy games. You can only equip 3 icons with 2 abilities each, leading to a lot of strategizing and figuring out the optimal build for your personal playstyle. The devs cited Final Fantasy V as a major inspiration for this system, and it really shows, especially once you master abilities and can equip them to different icons than the one they came from. This game feels very light on the RPG elements, but this system in particular feels very Final Fantasy. I remember seeing a video this one time talking about the difference between options and choices in game design, and that subtle distinction that you have to actively choose one ability over the other makes the game all that much more engaging. And the icon battles. Dear sweet Heidelin, the icon battles. These are without a doubt some of the most awesome fights I've ever played. They keep the overall same gameplay mechanics and rules as the normal game, but gives it its own unique flair, and it feels so much weightier and hard-hitting. The fights are epic in scope, and while they do have their fair share of QuickTime events, they never feel excessive. Like, it never feels like I'm playing a cutscene. It always feels like I'm the one taking these things down, and it feels good. So yeah, the combat is the meat of the gameplay, hands down, and it absolutely delivers. As for the rest of the game... well, okay, so here's the thing. Final Fantasy XVI was created by the dev team behind the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV. You can feel that game's DNA when you play 16. And while 14 may be my favorite game of all time, 16 borrows from it in places it probably shouldn't have. For example, the game follows a similar rhythm where you go into an area, ingratiate yourself with the local townsfolk, do a few quests, and cap off that area's story with a dungeon full of bosses. It's a good rhythm narrative-wise, but it does mean that you'll spend a lot of time doing fetch quests and talking to NPCs between the actual fun parts. Now, for an MMO that encourages you to take your time, that works fine. But for a high-octane, combat-focused thrill ride, it does result in some pacing issues here and there. In particular, there's a section about halfway through where Mid needs your help constructing a ship, and I'll be honest, it was kind of a drag. The game has its fair share of side quests, too, and... I mean, they're fine. The quests themselves aren't really anything special. Go to a place, collect some items, kill some monsters, yada yada. Nothing you haven't seen before. But I'd still recommend doing them because the character development and world building that comes with them are genuinely fantastic. The further you go through the main story, the more the bearer plot kind of fades into the background, but those aspects are fully explored in the side quests, and those side stories are great. And while we're on the topic of side quests, I gotta say I love the renown system. Okay, so the way it works is that you're out doing quests and hunting dangerous monsters, word spreads of your exploits, and people will start donating items and materials to your cause. It's a cool idea that makes it all the more rewarding to do these quests and really makes you feel like you're making a difference in the world. Again, the quests themselves are inoffensive at best. Not terrible, don't get me wrong. Travel in this game is fast enough that you never feel like too much time's being wasted, but you gotta understand, unless the quest marker has a plus sign on it, you're doing them for the story. Incidentally, do all the plus sign quests. It was a rule in 14 and it's a rule here too. Trust me, it'll make your life so much easier. Then there's the way items work, where you're severely restricted on how many potions you're allowed to have at any given time. You do get to expand your inventory size later on, but from the start, only being able to carry 4 potions at a time feels overly restrictive. I get that items are just supposed to be a safety net, but still. It's a design choice I'm not totally sure how I feel about. This, to me, feels like a direct reaction to Final Fantasy XV, where items were so powerful they practically made the game impossible to lose. Just pause the game and chug a bunch of potions and you're good to go. I agree that was an issue, but it feels like Final Fantasy XVI kind of overcorrected. The way I would have handled it is that you still have a large inventory size, but you're limited on the amount that you're allowed to use per battle. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for Clive to be digging around in his bag for potions in the middle of a fight, but having a few on hand is pretty reasonable. But I got used to it and the game felt designed around it, so what do I know? Then there's the matter of the game's slow start. Now again, I'm a Final Fantasy XIV player, so I can't exactly begrudge a game for being a slow burn, but it takes the game a good long while to get to any combat. As a matter of fact, I timed it. If you don't count the tutorial, it takes around 40 minutes to get to any actual combat, and the game waits even longer to give you access to new icons and limit breaks and the like. I didn't mind personally because the story was that engaging, and it's not like it's the only Final Fantasy game to have this problem, but I can understand if it's a turnoff for some people. After that, there's just my minor nitpicks, like the inexplicable lack of a mini-map, or the fact that jumping and talking are both mapped to the same button, so I jump around like an idiot trying to talk to someone. But honestly, in spite of all of that, I love the heck out of this game. Do I wish Final Fantasy would go back to a more traditional turn-based RPG with more traditional RPG elements? Of course! As a matter of fact, I saw this post on Twitter the other day poking fun at the divisive reaction to the gameplay, and it made me chuckle because I would genuinely, unironically love to see this sort of character building from a Final Fantasy game. But that doesn't mean I resent this game for taking the opposite approach. Far from it. That's the magic of Final Fantasy for me. Each game brings something completely different to the table. They're allowed to play like totally different games if they want because the soul of Final Fantasy is still there. There may be a wholly revamped gameplay system, but there's always those familiar thematic elements there to ground the more out there stuff. So with all that out of the way, I love Final Fantasy XVI. The story is great, the characters are amazing, the combat is incredibly fun and feels really rewarding to do it well, the boss fights are epic, the music is phenomenal, the only things holding it back are the pacing issues and the occasional missed opportunity. So my final score? It's honestly kinda hard to say. I want to give it a 9, but I remember that tedious shipbuilding quest. I want to give it an 8, but I remember the fantastic character work that really got to me on an emotional level. It's right on the line between A tier and B tier for me. It's hard to say for sure. But I will say this. Final Fantasy XVI is the reason I bought a PlayStation 5, and it did not disappoint me. I highly recommend it.